The moment Qatar threatened military retaliation against Israel, the strategic architecture of this conflict stopped being manageable in any conventional sense. Qatar is supposed to be on the American side. It hosts the largest American military base in the region. It has been conducting back-channel diplomacy on Washington's behalf since the opening days of this war. And Israel, Washington's closest military partner in the operation that started all of this, bombed a gas installation that Qatar partially owns. Trump came out and said it was the last time that Israel had misbehaved, that it would not happen again. The statement arrived after Qatar put an ultimatum on the table and after Iran spent the following hours telling Qatar exactly what it has been telling Gulf states since February 28th. We told you this would happen. The contradiction at the center of American strategy in this conflict has never been more visible. The country conducting this war on America's behalf is pushing America's most important Gulf ally toward the country America is fighting. And Washington's response is a public promise to control an ally that has demonstrated repeatedly that it does not ask Washington's permission before acting. Subscribe to From Report right now and turn on notifications. The Qatar-Israel rupture, the oil executive ultimatum delivered inside the White House, and the oil price trajectory toward $200 per barrel are not separate stories. They are the same story, and assembling them correctly tells you something about where this conflict is heading, that no official briefing is currently communicating. The meeting that happened at the White House between senior executives from Exxon, Chevron, and Phillips 66 and Trump administration officials deserves more analytical attention than it has received. Because when the companies that theoretically benefit from rising oil prices are telling the president that the situation is getting out of hand, the message being delivered is not a market complaint. It is a structural warning from the sector that understands energy economics better than any government agency. The executives told the administration directly that the worst of the energy disruption has not yet arrived, that the Hormuz closure affecting approximately 20% of globally traded oil will continue generating chaos, that prices will continue rising, and that the escalation trajectory currently in place produces an outcome that crosses the threshold from profitable for the industry to destructive for the economy that the industry depends on. That distinction matters. Oil companies profit from price increases up to a specific threshold, the point at which prices become high enough to permanently alter consumer behavior rather than simply extracting more revenue from existing demand. Above that threshold, high prices accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels, destroy the discretionary spending that keeps the broader economy functioning, and generate political consequences that produce regulatory responses worse for the industry than the original market conditions. The executives sitting in the White House were not complaining that prices were too high for their quarterly earnings. They were warning that prices were approaching the level at which the structural foundation of the fossil fuel economy begins to erode permanently. The American Energy Secretary has stated that he does not rule out oil reaching $200 per barrel. That level has not been seen in 4 decades. At $200 per barrel, retail gasoline prices in the United States roughly double from current levels. The cascading effect through every supply chain that touches energy, which is every supply chain on Earth, produces food price increases, transportation cost increases, manufacturing cost increases, and the kind of sustained inflation that destroyed a previous administration's political viability and produced the electoral outcome that brought the current administration to power. The Kharg Island situation reveals the internal contradiction at the center of American strategic decision-making in this conflict with a precision that the official framing cannot accommodate. Kharg Island is Iran's primary oil export terminal, the facility through which the overwhelming majority of Iranian crude reaches global markets. Trump announced that American forces had struck the island. The operational reality of what was actually struck is the analytically significant detail. Military installations on the island were hit. The oil export infrastructure was left intact. That targeting decision was not an oversight. It was a deliberate choice, driven by the same calculation that has constrained American targeting decisions throughout this conflict. Destroying Iran's oil export capacity would remove a significant volume of crude from global markets simultaneously with the Hormuz closure, the South Pass damage, the Ras Laffan fire, and the Saudi refinery drone strikes. The combined supply disruption that combination produces would drive oil prices to levels that trigger the structural economic consequences the oil executives warned about in the White House meeting, the transition threshold beyond which consumer behavior changes permanently, beyond which the global recession that Goldman Sachs modeled as a tail risk becomes a baseline scenario. Iran has understood this constraint from the beginning of the conflict and has been exploiting it methodically. Every time the United States and Israel hesitate to strike Iranian oil infrastructure because doing so would accelerate the global energy crisis, Iran's oil weapon gains relative strength. Every time American forces strike military targets while leaving energy infrastructure intact, Iran's operational capacity to sustain the conflict is preserved, while the message being sent to the global market is that the United States cannot fully prosecute the energy dimension of this war without destroying the global economy it depends on. The result is a contradiction that Iran's strategic planners built their response around from day one. Iran is using its oil as a weapon. American military actions are making that weapon more effective by demonstrating the limits of what the United States is willing to do to neutralize it. The escalation trap that this conflict has entered is one that defense analysts and military theorists have documented with sufficient historical evidence that its mechanics should be familiar to anyone who has studied how limited military operations become prolonged commitments. The logic begins with a decision to change a bad strategic situation through a decisive military action. Strike a military target, calculate that the strike will alter the adversary's decision-making, wait for the capitulation that the strike was supposed to produce. When the capitulation does not arrive, the analysis concludes that the strike was insufficient and that a larger strike will produce the desired result. The larger strike does not produce capitulation either. The adversary adapts its tactics, hardens its resistance, and presents a new set of targets that require another strike larger than the last. Each successive strike requires more force than the previous one to produce the same psychological and operational effect. The force commitment escalates, the exit becomes progressively more difficult to find, and the original objective, the specific limited goal that justified the initial strike, becomes obscured by the accumulating logic of escalation that has replaced it. This is the pattern that produced 500,000 American military personnel in Vietnam. It is the pattern that produced the Iraq commitment that lasted 2 decades. It is the pattern that 50,000 Marines in the Gulf theater are now beginning to replicate, with the additional 2,500 being deployed from the Indo-Pacific joining the force already in place. Not because the strategic situation has improved, but because the escalation logic requires more force to produce the effect that previous applications of force did not produce. Robert Pape's analysis of the escalation trap describes the mechanism precisely. When a bad status quo is challenged with a decisive military action and the adversary responds by changing tactics rather than capitulating, the logic of the original decision demands escalation. Each escalation step is justified by the failure of the previous one. The exit from this cycle requires either achieving the original objective, which the operational record of 21 days suggests is not imminent, or accepting the political cost of acknowledging that the objective is not achievable through the available means. Neither option is currently visible in the administration's public positioning. The global energy system's structural vulnerability that this conflict is exposing is not a Middle Eastern problem. It is a problem for every economy on Earth that has built its functioning around the assumption that the physical infrastructure of global oil supply is stable, predictable, and protected from exactly the kind of disruption that is now occurring simultaneously across multiple nodes. Canada produces oil, Mexico produces oil. Both countries set their domestic energy prices in reference to a global market whose benchmark prices are determined by what is happening in the Persian Gulf. A Mexican gas station cannot independently price its fuel based on Mexican production costs. It prices based on global benchmarks that the current conflict is driving toward $200 per barrel. A Canadian consumer's heating bill does not reflect Canadian energy abundance. It reflects the global price signal being generated by the Hormuz closure, the South Pars damage, the Ras Laffan fire, and the cumulative disruption of the most concentrated energy production geography on Earth. Energy independence, the political narrative that every government in the Western world has been selling its population for decades, is a myth in the context of a globalized commodity market. It describes self-sufficiency in production while ignoring the pricing mechanism that determines what that production is worth and what consumers pay for it. A country can produce all the oil it needs domestically and still pay the global market price for that oil, because the alternative, selling it below the global price, is economically irrational for the producing companies operating in the market. The Hormuz closure does not affect Canadian oil production. It affects the global price at which that production is valued, which is the price that determines what Canadians pay at the pump. This is the dimension of this conflict that the political framing of energy independence consistently fails to communicate. That the interconnection of the global energy market means that price disruptions in the Persian Gulf arrive in the household budgets of people in Toronto, Mexico City, Vancouver, and Veracruz, regardless of whether their countries have any oil relationship with the Middle East. The behavioral threshold that oil industry executives fear, the price level at which consumers permanently change their relationship with fossil fuels rather than simply absorbing a temporary cost increase, is the strategic endpoint that neither the oil companies nor the Trump administration wants to reach, but that the current price trajectory is approaching. When retail gasoline prices in the United States hit $7 per gallon, approximately double current levels, consistent with oil at $200 per barrel, the economic calculation for vehicle purchasing changes permanently for a significant portion of the consumer market. The decision is no longer whether to absorb higher fuel costs. It becomes whether to eliminate fuel costs entirely by transitioning to electric vehicles. Once that behavioral shift occurs at scale, it does not reverse when oil prices decline. The infrastructure investment, the purchasing decision, and the consumption pattern change permanently. The Chinese electric vehicle market has produced vehicles that are technologically competitive with American and European alternatives at price points that American consumers would find attractive. The tariff barriers preventing their import were removed. Canada recently negotiated trade arrangements with China that reduced the tariff friction on Chinese electric vehicles. The irony that the oil industry executives sitting in the White House were implicitly acknowledging is that the conflict generating the price spike that pushes consumers toward electric vehicles is simultaneously accelerating the obsolescence of the fossil fuel economic model that the conflict was ostensibly designed to protect American strategic interests in preserving. Trump's energy dominance strategy, control the oil, control the geopolitical leverage that oil provides, is producing the precise price conditions that accelerate the transition away from oil dependence. The war for oil is making oil less relevant in the economies that matter most for the long-term demand picture. And the companies whose executive delivered the White House warning understand this better than anyone, which is why their message was not a complaint about short-term price volatility, but a warning about long-term structural consequences. The picture that assembles from Qatar's military ultimatum, the oil executive warning, the KG Island contradiction, the escalation trap mechanics, and the $200 oil trajectory is one that the official framing of American strategic success in this conflict cannot contain. Qatar, hosting the largest American military base in the region, conducting American back-channel diplomacy, publicly aligned with the American-led effort, has threatened military retaliation against Israel following an Israeli strike on Qatar-owned gas infrastructure. Iran is telling Qatar what it has been telling every Gulf state. The protection Washington promised did not protect Rosafan, did not protect the Saudi refinery, and will not protect whatever comes next. The choice is between continuing to host the forces that make Qatar a target and finding an accommodation with Tehran that removes that targeting rationale. The American oil industry's most powerful executives have delivered a private warning to the administration that the energy disruption trajectory exceeds the threshold of what the global economy can absorb without producing structural consequences that damage American economic interests more severely than any Iranian military capability. The administration's response is to publicly promise that Israel will not strike Iranian energy infrastructure again, a promise to control an ally that has demonstrated it operates autonomously on the most consequential military decisions of this conflict. Oil is approaching the price level that permanently alters consumer behavior in the direction that accelerates the obsolescence of the fossil fuel economy. The Hormuz closure, the South Pars damage, the Ras Laffan fire, the Saudi refinery strikes, and the Fujairah terminal drone attacks have simultaneously placed every major node of Gulf energy infrastructure under active threat for the first time since 1973. Dubai real estate has fallen 30%. Gulf sovereign wealth funds, whose investments permeate American and European financial markets, are reassessing risk in ways that, if they produce capital withdrawal, will deliver consequences to global financial markets that the current energy price disruption has not yet approached. And the war that was supposed to last 72 hours is on day 21, with the escalation trap fully engaged, with no declared objective achieved, with no exit strategy visible, and with the very companies that profit from fossil fuels telling the administration that this is getting out of hand. Subscribe to From Report and turn on notifications. When Qatar's military ultimatum produces a formal diplomatic consequence that changes the operational geometry of the American-based network in the Gulf, the analysis will be here. When oil crosses the price threshold that the oil executive warning identified as the structural danger point, the analysis will be here. When the escalation trap produces its next iteration, the additional force commitment justified by the failure of the previous application of force, the analysis will be here. Evidence first, analysis second. What it means for you always.